So now that we have our first entity, what we're going to use is Entity Framework to scaffold our database. And in order to do this, we're going to need to use a DbContext class. And what we're going to do is going to create a new file or a new class inside our persistence project. And what we'll do is we'll just rename class1.cs to DataContext.cs. So we'll have a class called DataContext, and I also need to update this to DataContext as well. And what we want to do here is derive from an entity framework class called DbContext. But because we're in our persistence project, we actually don't have access to this at the moment. And what we need to do is we need to add entity framework into this particular project. So what we can do is we can open up our command shell, and what we'll make use of is the NuGet package manager we added as an extension to go ahead and install this. So I'm just going to say NuGet package manager add package, and what we need here is Microsoft.entityFramework core. And if I press return, this should give me a list of options related to Microsoft Entity Framework Core. We need two of the packages from here. We need both Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core SQLite. And importantly, both of these need to be exactly the same version. So I'm going to select Entity Framework Core. And we want to be careful here when selecting the version of this. We want to make sure this matches our runtime exactly. So we're on version 3.0.0 of the .NET Core runtime, and that's the version we want to match with Entity Framework Core as well. So let's go ahead and add this one. And we want to add this into our persistence project. So let's select this as well. And this will give us the option to restore, but we do actually need to install another package here as well. And once again, I'm just going to type in Microsoft.entityFramework Core. And this time we're going to select the one for Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite, and once again make sure we select the same version as our runtime, which is 3.0.0, and once again add this to our persistence project as well. Once these are both added, we can click on the restore button, and we're going to get some problems here, and let's go and take a look at the output of what's gone wrong. Now the issue with this is that Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite 3.0.0 is not compatible with NetStandard 2.0, and it only supports NetStandard 2.1. Or it also supports NetCore App 3.0, but in this case the minimum version that we can use with Entity Framework Core 3.0 is NetStandard 2.1. Now what this means is we're going to need to make some changes to our CS proj files, and if we make a change to our persistence project where we've added these particular packages, then we can just come in here and say NetStandard 2.1. And then what we can do is attempt to do a restore again, and in fact we're getting problems here, so I'm just going to stop my application from running and just type in .NET restore, and what we'll find is we're going to get other problems now because our persistence project is not compatible with NetStandard 2.0. So what this means is we basically, when we update one of our class libraries to NetStandard 2.1, we also need to do that with our other class libraries as well. So let's just go through and update these to NetStandard 2.1 for the domain project, for the application project, and the API project is already using NetCore App 3.0, which is okay to use with NetStandard 2.1. That's absolutely fine as well. So with these changes in place, what we should be able to do then is come into our terminal window. Once again, just clear the mess that's my screen at the moment, and we'll try our .NET restore one more time. And this time we get success because Entity Framework Core is compatible with NetStandard 2.1. So what this means is that we can come back into our data context file, and then we'll use the quick fix again on our DbContext, and this time it gives us the option to bring in a using statement for Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So let's go ahead and select this. And now this is imported. If we look at the description of this, a DbContext instance represents a session with the database and can be used to query and save instances of our entities. So this is what we need to be able to query our database, and it's got a few other tricks up its sleeve as well. And one of them is to make use of entity framework migrations, which kind of gives us the ability to script a new database based on the entities that we create and specify inside this particular class. So what we need to do is we need to give this particular file a constructor. So I'm just going to type in CTOR and call it DataContext as the name of the constructor. And this takes some parameters, or a parameter, and we need to pass it some DbContext options and call it options. And we also need to use the options from the base class. So in order to do this, we'll specify base and options as well. And if you miss this off, then this will cause problems creating the migration. Now below the constructor, we don't need to actually add anything inside the constructor itself, but below the constructor, what we need to pass this is dbSet properties, or properties of type dbSet. And then we specify the entity that we want to use. Now in this case, we've only got one entity, it's called value. And in order to access this, we need to bring in domain, because that's where our entities are located. So I'll say using domain. And what we do is we give this a name, and it's going to be called values. Now this values property is what's going to be used for the table name inside SQLite. And we'll see that when we actually go ahead and create our database. So with this in place, what we need to do is we need to add this as a service, because we're going to be using this DataContext class, and we're going to inject it into various parts of our application so that we can query these entities in our database. And to do this, we're going to need to go back to our startup class, and we're going to go to our services container, or our configure services method, which is our dependency injection container, because we want to make our data context available to other parts of our application. And the ordering isn't that important inside our configure services method. It is inside the configure method, but in the services method, we can just add it where it feels appropriate. So I'm just going to add it above our add controllers, and I'm going to say services. And what we want to do here is add our DbContext, as there's a special extension method for DbContexts inside our services collection. So we're going to add the DbContext, and then we need to tell it the type that we're looking for here, and that's going to be our data context. And we should be able to bring this in from our persistence. So we'll specify the use the quick fix, control period, and then using persistence. And inside here, we need to give it some options. So I'm going to specify opt and provide a lambda expression here. And we'll say opt and use SQLite. And let's see if we can bring in Entity Framework Core here, and we can. So I'll select this. And then we need to give SQLite a connection string. Now, we're going to use our configuration files to store our connection string. So what we're going to do is make use of the configuration that we have available that's being injected into our startup class. So inside the opt use SQLite, we're going to specify use configuration. And there's an option inside here to go and get the connection string. Now, this is just shorthand for getting a section from one of our configuration files. And it's going to look for a section inside there called, very specifically, connection strings, pluralized. So we'll use this one to say get connection string, and then we're going to just specify inside our configuration file default connection. And I'll just close off this with a semicolon. So now we have this in place, what we're going to do next is we're just going to head over to one of our configuration files, in this case the appsettings.json. And inside here, we're going to specify a section for connection strings. And remember, this needs to match exactly what we have, or what it's looking for, which is connection strings, title case, pluralized. And inside here, we're going to specify the default connection, which matches what it's looking for. And what we need to provide here is a SQLite connection string. And SQLite connection strings are really simple. All we need to do is specify a data source, and then we just need to give the file name for the database, because SQLite is a file-based database system. So in this case, we're just going to call it reactivities.db. And this is all we need in place to create a Entity Framework Core migration, which is going to allow us to scaffold out our database based on the code that we've written so far. And we'll take a look at that next.